The salvage hauler broken wing floated like a corpse through the Calixian debris field. Its hull had been torn open by weapons fire, and whatever life support systems remained were gasping their last breaths. Deep inside the cargo hold, where no light had shone for 3 days, a Felixian mother named Shirala lay chained against a cold metal wall. Her silver fur, once pristine and beautiful, was now matted with dried blood and grime. She could barely move. The heavy chains bit into her wrists and ankles, locked tight with biometric seals that only her captors could open. Against her chest, 3 tiny kits whimpered and mewled. They were so small, barely a week old, their eyes still sealed shut. Their thin cries were getting weaker as the hours passed and the cold crept deeper into the cargo hold. Shirala had been cargo. Just merchandise. The Vrasht slavers who'd raided her colony world hadn't seen her as a person. They saw credits. Her species had enhanced reflexes that made them valuable as guards or assassins. Their night vision was better than military-grade sensors. The Vrasht had chained her up pregnant, planning to sell her and her unborn children to the highest bidder in the outer markets. Then everything went wrong for the slavers. A rival pirate clan had ambushed them 2 systems back. The Vrasht crew had scrambled for the escape pods, abandoning their ship and everything on it, including the cargo hold full of living beings they'd left chained and helpless. Shirala had given birth alone in the darkness, 3 days ago, with no food and diminishing air. She'd used her teeth to chew through the umbilical cords. She'd cleaned her babies with a tongue that was growing drier by the hour. Now she knew they were dying. The ship's automated distress beacon was pulsing out into the void, but she'd learned enough about galactic law to know the truth. Most species wouldn't respond to a beacon in lawless space. The risk was too high. The profit was non-existent. They would drift here until the oxygen ran out and then it would be over. Shirala curled her body as tightly as she could around her kits, trying to share what little warmth remained in her failing body. She began to sing. It was the death song of her people, an ancient melody that prepared the soul for the journey into darkness. Her voice cracked with thirst, but she sang for her babies. They deserved at least that much. A mother's voice in their final moments. The mathematics were brutally simple. The oxygen would fail before starvation could take them. Maybe 6 more hours. Maybe less. She sang and waited for the end. Then Shirala heard something that made her ears swivel forward in confusion. A sound. Metal on metal. The magnetic clamps of a docking collar engaging with the hull. Someone was here. Her heart began to race. Were the Vrasht coming back? Would they shoot her where she lay for being too much trouble? She heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Heavy. Deliberate. Bipedal. The cargo hold door screeched as someone forced it open against its warped frame. A figure appeared in the doorway, backlit by the corridor emergency lights. A humanoid in a battered vacuum suit covered in dents and repair patches. The figure stepped inside and reached up to unlock their helmet. Shirala's breath caught. A human. She'd heard of them. The galaxy told stories about humans, most of them warnings. They were from a death world. They were aggressive. They were unpredictable. They were dangerous. The human pulled off his helmet and breathed the cargo hold's tainted air without even flinching. His face was weathered and tired, with several days of stubble on his jaw. He looked around the cargo hold with a handheld scanner, and the device led him straight to where Shirala lay in the shadows. He approached slowly and knelt down beside her. His eyes widened when he saw the chains, then moved to her kits. Something changed in his expression. His jaw tightened. "Hey there," he said softly. His voice was gentle despite his rough appearance. "Name's Jake Cooper. Let's get you out of those chains, okay?" Shirala stared at him. She didn't understand his language yet, but his tone was clear. He wasn't here to hurt her. The ship's failing translator flickered to life, giving her broken fragments of meaning. Jake pulled a plasma cutter from his belt and examined the chains. Most species would have done the calculation by now. Shirala knew this. Saving her would cost time, resources, and energy. There was no profit in rescuing chained cargo from a dead ship. The logical choice would be to take whatever salvage was valuable and leave. But Jake didn't leave. He fired up the plasma cutter and began working on the first chain lock. He kept talking to her in that soft, steady voice, trying to reassure her even though she could barely understand the words. His hands were steady, patient. Shirala's predator instincts, honed by millions of years of evolution, told her something she would remember forever. This human was different. Humans were different. And maybe, just maybe, her kits would live to see another day. Shirala tried desperately to communicate with Jake through the ship's dying translator system. The device flickered and sparked, giving only broken words, but she gestured frantically at the chains around her wrists and ankles. She needed him to understand. These weren't normal restraints. They were biometric locks, keyed specifically to Vrash DNA signatures. Only her captors could open them with a touch of their clawed hands. The translator crackled out enough words for Jake to understand the problem. His face fell slightly as he examined the locks more closely with his scanner. The data confirmed what Shirala was trying to tell him. Breaking through biometric chains like these would take hours. Maybe 6 or 7 hours of continuous work with the right tools. Maybe longer with what he had available. Shirala watched his face carefully. She'd learned to read expressions during her captivity. This was the moment most species would make the calculation. She could see him looking through the viewport at his own ship docked alongside the wreck. It was tiny. A single-pilot mining vessel, old and patched together. Barely enough life support for one person, let alone a full-grown Felixian and 3 infants who needed specialized care. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Saving them would cost him resources he probably didn't have. Time he couldn't spare. The risk of staying in lawless space for hours while he worked on chains that might not even break. Any rational being would apologize and leave. She'd already accepted this. At least her kits had felt a moment of hope before the end. But Jake didn't leave. He stood up and headed back toward the airlock. Shirala's heart sank. Of course. She'd been foolish to hope. Then she heard him moving around in the docking tube. Heavy objects being dragged. He came back through the cargo hold door carrying oxygen canisters in both arms. Big ones. He set them down and went back for more. Trip after trip, Jake hauled supplies from his ship. Oxygen canisters that he carefully connected to the cargo hold's emergency systems. Thermal blankets that he wrapped around Shirala and her kits. The babies were so cold their mewling had become weak and thread-like. He tucked the blankets gently around them, his rough hands surprisingly careful with their tiny bodies. Then he brought food. Nutrient paste in universal packets designed to work with most species' biology. Shirala hadn't eaten in 4 days. She tore into the packets with shaking hands, and for the first time since giving birth, she had milk for her kits. They latched onto her and nursed desperately. Their crying finally stopped. The cargo hold became quiet except for the sound of her babies feeding. Jake watched for a moment with a soft smile, then turned back to the chains and got to work. He worked methodically, testing different approaches with his plasma cutter. The device would heat up, and he'd have to stop and let it cool down before continuing. During these breaks he'd check on the kits. He touched their tiny heads with one finger, making sure they were warming up. He adjusted the thermal blankets. He even fashioned a proper nest for them using his own spare clothes from his ship. His jacket became their bedding. His spare shirts became walls to keep out the draft. "Can't leave kids to die in the dark," Jake said while wrapping the smallest kit more securely in his jacket. The translator was working better now with restored power. "That's just not how we do things where I'm from." Hours crawled by. Shirala watched this human work, and what she saw defied everything she knew about galactic civilization. Most species operated on logic and self-interest. You helped your own kind. You made deals that benefited both parties. You didn't waste resources on strangers who couldn't pay you back. But Jake didn't stop. The temperature in the cargo hold dropped further as the ship's systems continued failing. Shirala could see her own breath misting in the air. But Jake just sealed up his vac suit and kept working. His movements never slowed. When his plasma cutter finally burned out completely after 3 hours of continuous use, he didn't curse or give up. He just went back to his ship and returned with manual tools. Mechanical cutters. Pry bars. A hammer. He started working on the chain links themselves, hitting them again and again at their weak points. The sound echoed through the cargo hold. His hands started bleeding where the tools rubbed blisters, then tore the blisters open. Blood made the tools slippery. Shirala watched him stop just long enough to wrap his hands in cloth torn from his shirt, then continue working. The cloth turned red quickly. While he worked, Jake talked. The translator gave Shirala most of the words now. He told her about Earth. About a world where humans had evolved as persistence hunters. They weren't the fastest or the strongest, but they just didn't stop. They would chase prey for days until the animal collapsed from exhaustion. They developed this weird, irrational drive to protect helpless things. Even when logic said to walk away. "It's probably a defect, honestly," Jake said, grinning despite the blood on his hands and the sweat on his face. "My grandma used to say Coopers don't know when to quit. She meant it as a warning, but I always took it as a compliment. Stubbornness runs in the family." He hit the chain again. And again. And again. A link began to crack. Shirala finally began to understand why the galaxy whispered about humans with a mixture of fear and awe. They were terrifying not because they were monsters, but because they simply refused to accept reality. When the universe said something was impossible, humans heard it as a challenge. When logic said to give up, they dug in harder. They turned their own capacity for suffering into a weapon, enduring conditions that would kill other species just to prove a point. And the point Jake was proving, with bloody hands and exhausted eyes, was simple. These kids mattered. Their mother mattered. And he was going to save them or die trying. Jake had just freed Shirala's right arm when the proximity alarm started blaring. The sound echoed through the dead ship's corridors, harsh and urgent. Shirala's ears flattened against her skull. She knew that sound. Every captive learned to fear it. The sensors, still barely functional, showed a ship dropping out of faster-than-light travel nearby. Jake pulled up the data on his handheld scanner, and Shirala saw his jaw tighten. The carrion tooth. The Vrosht had come back. Her translator picked up their communications easily. The pirates weren't being subtle or careful. They were arguing among themselves about whether the salvage run was worth the fuel. One voice, harsh and clicking, complained about the merchandise they'd left behind. But mostly they were interested in the reactor core. Apparently it was worth decent credits on the black market, even damaged. Jake listened carefully as Shirala translated their words, her voice shaking. She watched his face change. It was subtle at first. His eyes went cold. His breathing slowed and deepened. His shoulders settled into a different posture. Every predator instinct Shirala possessed suddenly screamed danger. Not at the Vrosht coming to recapture her. At Jake. This was a human preparing to hunt. Jake worked faster on her remaining chains. He got her left arm free and immediately pressed something into her paw. Cold metal. Heavy. She looked down at the plasma pistol in confusion. Safety's here, Jake said, showing her the mechanism. His voice was calm, almost gentle, completely at odds with the lethal coldness in his eyes. Keep the kits behind you. Anyone comes through that door that isn't me, you point and squeeze. Got it? Shirala nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She'd never held a weapon before. Her people were peaceful traders before the Vrosht came. Jake checked his own weapons. A plasma pistol. A knife. Some kind of tool that could probably crack skulls. Then he did something that would haunt Shirala's dreams for years afterward. He smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of an apex predator that had just spotted prey. Time to teach these assholes why you don't abandon babies, Jake said. Then he was gone, moving into the corridor with a hunter's grace. The Vrosht boarded confidently. Shirala could hear them through the thin walls, their clicking language full of casual cruelty. They expected no resistance. Why would they? They'd left behind chained cargo on a dying ship. What threat could that possibly pose? They learned very quickly that they'd made a mistake. A fatal one. Shirala heard the first scream within minutes. It cut off abruptly. Then plasma fire, bright flashes visible through the cargo hold's broken door. More screams. The sound of something heavy hitting a wall. The Vrosht started shouting in panic instead of confidence. Their communications became frantic. Jake was using the ship itself as a weapon. The broken wing still had partial gravity controls in some sections. Shirala heard the systems cycling on and off. Zero gravity, then sudden crushing weight, then weightless again. The Vrosht weren't adapted for rapid changes like that. Humans apparently were. He used the shadows too. The emergency lighting created deep pools of darkness throughout the ship. Shirala heard Vrosht firing at nothing, wasting ammunition on phantoms. Then a scream from a completely different direction. Jake was hurting them, confusing them, making them panic. They were hunters who'd suddenly become prey, and they didn't know how to handle it. The ship's old bulkhead doors still had emergency power. Shirala heard them slamming shut, cutting off escape routes. Trapping individual Vrosht away from their group. Then silence. Then another scream. The Vrosht were learning what it meant to be hunted by a human. It took maybe 20 minutes. It felt like hours. Two Vrosht broke away from the main group and headed for the cargo hold. Shirala heard their claws clicking on the metal deck plates. Coming closer. She pulled her kits behind her body, wrapped in Jake's jacket and blankets. The smallest one made a tiny sound and she shushed it gently. Her paw tightened on the plasma pistol. She'd never killed anything before. But for her babies she would burn the universe down. The Vrosht came through the door expecting to reclaim their property. Instead they found a Felixian mother with a weapon and reflexes faster than their own. Shirala's species could see in almost total darkness. They could move in ways that seemed to defy physics. And when you gave one a human weapon and a reason to fight, they became something terrifying. The first Vrosht barely had time to register surprise before Shirala's plasma bolt caught him in the chest. The second one raised his weapon, but Felixian reflexes were meant for hunting flying prey in triple canopy forests. Shirala moved, fired, and raked with her claws all in one fluid motion. The Vrosht went down hard. She stood over the bodies, breathing hard, unable to believe what she'd just done. The plasma pistol shook in her paw. Then Jake appeared in the doorway. He was breathing hard, covered in burns and blood. Some of it was probably his. Most of it wasn't. He was carrying something in his left hand, and it took Shirala a moment to process what she was seeing. A severed hand. Vrosht. Still wearing the captain's rank rings. "Sorry about this," Jake said, noticing her stare. "It's practical, not pretty. But we need this." He knelt beside her remaining chains and pressed the dead captain's hand against the biometric lock. The scanner read the DNA signature, and with a hiss of releasing pressure, the chains fell away. All of them. After days of being bound, Shirala was free. Her legs nearly buckled. Jake caught her elbow, steadying her. His hand was warm despite the cold of the cargo hold. "Real. Solid. Can you walk?" he asked. Shirala nodded, not trusting her voice. Jake looked at her kits, still bundled in his makeshift nest. "Okay. Here's what's going to happen. We're taking my ship and getting the hell out of here. The carrion tooth is empty now, but their distress beacon might bring friends. We need to move fast." He offered her his hand. It was covered in blood and burns and the cloth wrappings were soaked through. But when Shirala took it, his grip was gentle. "Come on," Jake said with a tired smile. "Let's get you and the kids home." Shirala gathered her kits carefully, and together they walked out of the cargo hold that had been her prison. Behind them, the broken wing continued its slow death spiral. Ahead of them, Jake's small mining ship waited. It wasn't much, but it was freedom. It was safety. It was a human who'd decided that 3 alien babies mattered more than logic, profit, or his own survival. And Shirala knew with absolute certainty that she and her kits would follow this human anywhere. The broken wing was dead. There was no saving it. Jake made that determination quickly after checking the main systems one final time. The hull breaches were too extensive, the reactor was leaking radiation, and the life support had maybe an hour left before complete failure. They needed to leave immediately. Jake's ship, the Persistent, waited in the docking collar like a tiny lifeboat next to a sinking ocean vessel. Shirala carried her kits carefully across the connection tube, one at a time, while Jake grabbed whatever supplies he could salvage. When they were all safely aboard, Jake sealed the airlock and fired the undocking clamps. The Persistent pulled away and the broken wing became just another piece of debris in the field. Inside Jake's ship, Shirala looked around at what would be their home for the journey ahead. Her heart sank. The Persistent was a single-pilot mining vessel, old and worn. The main cabin was barely large enough for one person to live comfortably. There was one sleeping alcove, a tiny galley, a refresher unit so small you could barely turn around, and the cockpit. That was it. Jake was already at the navigation console, plotting their course. Shirala watched over his shoulder as the numbers came up on the screen. The nearest friendly station was Refuge Station, a neutral trading post on the edge of civilized space. It was their only real option. Everywhere else was either too far or too dangerous. The console displayed the travel time at maximum burn, 3 weeks. Maybe 22 days if they pushed the engines hard and got lucky with the stellar drift currents. Then Shirala saw the life support calculations and her blood went cold. The Persistent systems were designed for one human. The ship had enough oxygen, water, and climate control for one person for about 2 months of normal operation. But now there were 4 passengers. 1 adult Felixian, 1 human, and 3 kids who were small but still needed resources. She watched Jake run the numbers several times, trying different configurations. Each time the result was the same. Life support would last approximately 2 weeks. Maybe 15 days if they were very careful. The journey would take 22 days minimum. Someone would die. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Shirala felt her world collapsing. They'd escaped the Vrosht, survived the impossible, freed themselves from certain death. Only to die slowly in the empty space between stars. She looked at her kits, sleeping peacefully in the makeshift nest Jake had created for them. They didn't know how close death still was. Jake stood up from the console and started recalibrating the ship's systems manually. Shirala watched in confusion as he rerouted the life support priorities, directing most of the oxygen generation to the small cargo area where she'd set up the nest. He adjusted the temperature controls, making sure that area stayed warm while letting the rest of the ship run cooler. He was prioritizing her and the kits. "What are you doing?" Sharala asked through the translator. "Making sure you and the babies make it," Jake said simply. He pulled up the ration storage and started dividing it. 3/4 went into the cargo area. 1/4 stayed in the galley. "I'm putting myself on minimal rations. You need full nutrition for the kits." "No," Sharala said firmly. "The calculations say." "I know what the calculations say," Jake interrupted. He smiled, but it was tired. "But humans are good at running on empty. It's kind of what we do. Back on Earth, our ancestors used to chase prey animals for days, sometimes weeks. We just keep running until the animal collapsed from exhaustion. We're built for endurance, not sprints." Over the next few days, Sharala watched Jake implement his plan. He ate one small meal a day, sometimes less. He slept only 4 hours at a time, keeping watch over the systems constantly. He gave his full oxygen share to the cargo area, breathing the thinner atmosphere in the cockpit and main cabin. Within a week, she could see the changes in him. Jake was getting thinner. His face became more angular as the fat disappeared. His eyes looked larger, more sunken. But he never stopped moving. He taught Sharala how to operate the ship's basic functions. How to adjust course. How to monitor the engines. How to send a distress call if something went wrong. "Just in case," he said. "If I collapse, you need to be able to get help." Sharala's kits, meanwhile, were thriving. They were growing rapidly, their tiny bodies filling out with healthy fat. Their fur developed the beautiful luminescent quality that marked well-fed Felixian young. They started opening their eyes. They began to play with each other, tumbling around in their nest. They had no idea their mother cried herself to sleep every night, watching the human who saved them slowly starve. By the second week, Jake's movements were slower, more deliberate. He had to think about actions that should have been automatic. Sharala caught him staring at nothing sometimes, his mind drifting. But he never stopped working. Never stopped checking on her and the kits. Never complained. "Tell me about your family," Sharala asked one night, trying to keep him engaged and alert. Jake smiled, his lips cracked from dehydration despite the water rations. "My grandma raised me. Tough old woman. She used to say Coopers don't know when to quit. Said it was a family curse." He laughed weakly. "I think she'd be proud of this. Stubborn to the end." By the third week, Jake was a ghost of himself. His clothes hung loose on a frame that was mostly bone. His hands shook when he worked the controls. But those hands never stopped. He kept the ship running. Kept them on course. Kept breathing even when every breath looked like it cost him everything. 3 days from Refuge Station, Sharala woke to find Jake slumped over the navigation console. She rushed to him, her heart pounding. He was still breathing but barely. Unconscious. His body had finally given out. "No," Sharala whispered. "No, no, no. You don't get to die now. Not after everything." She dragged him to the sleeping alcove and covered him with every blanket she could find. Then she went to the cockpit. Her hands were shaking as she took the pilot's seat. Jake had taught her the basics, but she'd never actually flown a ship before. The kits cried in their nest, sensing their mother's fear. "Mama will be right back," she called to them. "I promise." Sharala studied the controls, remembering everything Jake had shown her. She checked their position. 72 hours from Refuge Station at current speed. She looked at the engine display and made a decision Jake would probably have yelled at her for. She pushed the engines past their safety limits. The Persistent shuddered and groaned, but the speed increased. 60 hours. 55. The engine screamed in protest. Sharala opened all emergency channels and broadcast in her broken standard, her accent thick but her words clear. "This is Felixian Sharala aboard human vessel Persistent. Human pilot down. 3 infant passengers safe. Engines critical. Coming in fast. Please help. Please. He saved us. Don't let him die." The Persistent limped into Refuge Station 48 hours later on engines that were literally melting. Station emergency teams met them at the dock. Medical personnel rushed Jake to their facilities while Sharala collapsed in relief, her kits crying in her arms. Stubbornness, she'd learned, was contagious. And she'd caught it from the best. 2 weeks after arriving at Refuge Station, Sharala stood in the council chamber with her 3 kits playing at her feet. They were healthy now, their fur thick and shining with that beautiful luminescence that marked thriving Felixian young. They tumbled over each other, making the chittering sounds of happy babies, completely unaware of the serious discussion happening above their heads. Jake sat beside her in a medical hoverchair. The station doctors had forbidden him from walking too much yet. He'd lost dangerous amounts of weight during the journey, and his body was still recovering from the edge of starvation. But he'd refused to miss this meeting. When the medical staff tried to make him stay in bed, he'd simply disconnected the 4 lines himself and left. The doctors had learned quickly that telling Jake Cooper he couldn't do something was a waste of breath. The council chamber was an impressive room, designed to intimidate. High ceilings, polished floors, and a raised platform where 5 council members sat looking down at petitioners. The lead administrator was a Quelix named Torvin, a species known for their strict adherence to rules and regulations. His 6 eyes blinked in sequence as he reviewed the datapad containing Shirala's case. "This is highly irregular," Torvin began, his mechanical translator giving his words a clipped, disapproving tone. "According to galactic law, the Felixian designated Shirala owes human Jake Cooper a life debt of substantial magnitude. He rescued her and 3 dependents from certain death, provided transport, and nearly died ensuring their survival." Shirala's ears flattened against her skull. She knew what was coming. "However," Torvin continued, "the Felixian has no resources. No clan affiliation. No assets. No means of repaying this debt." He looked at Shirala with something like pity mixed with contempt. "We recommend assignment to an indenture program. She would work for an approved contractor for a period of 10 to 15 years to repay rescue costs, medical expenses, and transport fees. The kits would be placed in species-appropriate care facilities until—" "Absolutely not," Jake interrupted. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the chamber like a blade. "She doesn't owe me anything." Torvin's eyes blinked in confusion. "Excuse me?" Perhaps the translator malfunctioned. "The life debt is clearly established. Payment must be—" "I said no," Jake repeated. He leaned forward in his chair, and despite his weakened state, there was steel in his voice. "I didn't save them for payment. I didn't save them to put her in some kind of indentured servitude. I saved them because it was the right thing to do." Another council member, a Hravathi female named Sela, spoke up. "Human Cooper, we understand your sentiment, but there are protocols. Galactic law exists to prevent." "I don't care about protocols," Jake said flatly. "Where I come from, you don't send someone a bill for pulling them out of a burning building. You don't charge a mother for saving her kids. That's not how we do things." The council members looked at each other in bewilderment. This wasn't how galactic civilization worked. Everything had a cost. Every service required payment. The idea of rescue without compensation was almost incomprehensible to them. Torvin tried a different approach. "Human Cooper, even if we waive the debt, there are other complications. You cannot simply keep alien refugees. There are immigration laws, species integration requirements, housing regulations. You live on a single pilot vessel with no facilities for—" "Then modify my ship," Jake interrupted again. "Expand the life support. Add proper living quarters. I've got the credits from my mining contracts. Use those." "That's not the issue," Sela said, frustration creeping into her voice. "You cannot simply adopt aliens from another species. The legal framework doesn't allow." "Then change the framework," Jake said. He locked eyes with each council member in turn. "I didn't ask permission to save them. I'm not asking permission now. Shirala and her kits are coming with me. We're a crew. That's the end of it." The chamber erupted in protests. Multiple council members speaking at once. Legal precedents being quoted. Regulations being cited. Immigration codes being referenced. The noise grew louder and more chaotic. Then Shirala stepped forward. Her movement was deliberate and formal, the way her people moved during important ceremonies. The council members fell silent, curious about what the Felixian would do. Shirala reached out and took Jake's forearm in both her paws. She met his eyes, making sure he understood what was about to happen. Then, with precise movements, she extended her claws and drew them across his forearm in 3 parallel lines. Not deep enough to cause serious injury, but deep enough to scar. Blood welled up immediately. The council members gasped. Several stood up in shock. Jake didn't flinch. He watched Shirala's face, trusting her completely. In Felixian tradition, Shirala announced in her improving standard, her accent thick but her words clear, "This is the clan mark. It means permanent family bond. Blood to blood. It cannot be broken by law or time or distance." Her 3 kits, sensing the importance of the moment, scrambled up to Jake's chair. Following their mother's example, they each placed their tiny paws on Jake's arm and made their own marks. 3 sets of small scratches alongside their mother's, barely breaking the skin but symbolically identical. "He is clan now," Shirala continued, her voice carrying through the silent chamber. Where he goes we go. His ship is our ship. His family is our family. This is irrevocable under Felixian law, which the Galactic Council recognizes as valid for cultural practices. She turned to face the Council directly. You cannot separate clan. You cannot indenture clan members separately. You cannot override this bond with your regulations. It is done. Torvin sank back into his seat, his 6 eyes blinking rapidly. He consulted his datapad frantically. The problem was clear. The Galactic Council did indeed recognize cultural bonding practices. They'd established that precedent hundreds of years ago to respect diverse species traditions. Shirala had just used their own laws against them. Jake looked down at his arm at the 3 parallel scars from Shirala and the tiny marks from her kits. Blood ran down to his wrist. He started laughing. It was quiet at first, then grew louder. The council members stared at him like he'd lost his mind. Guess I've got family now, Jake said, grinning up at Shirala. Should have warned me that adoption ceremonies involve bloodletting though. Shirala's whiskers twitched in the Felixian equivalent of a smile. You gave us your blood when you starved yourself to keep us alive. This is just making it official. The council had no choice. They processed the paperwork with obvious reluctance. The persistence registration was modified to show Jake Cooper as primary pilot and Shirala as navigator. 3 dependents listed. Living quarters expansion approved and scheduled. Immigration status. Family unit approved for unrestricted travel. When they left the council chamber, Jake's arm was properly bandaged, and Shirala carried her smallest kit while the other 2 walked alongside them. Station residents stopped and stared at the unusual group. A human and a Felixian family, walking together like it was the most natural thing in the universe. The persistent left refuge station 3 days later with expanded quarters, upgraded life support and a crew of 4. Jake taught Shirala how to navigate properly. She taught him Felixian lullabies that he sang to the kits in his terrible accent, making them chirp with laughter. And across the galaxy, another story began to spread about humans. Not about their weapons or their stubbornness or their endurance, though those stories continued too. This was a different kind of story. About a species that didn't calculate the cost before helping. That ran toward danger when everyone else ran away. That adopted the abandoned and defended them with everything they had. That built families not from biology but from choice. Shirala's kits grew up speaking 2 languages, learning 2 cultures, belonging to 2 species. They grew up human in all the ways that mattered. Stubborn, loyal, protective, and absolutely refusing to accept that some things were impossible. They grew up as Coopers. And that made all the difference.